Good morning. It's Wednesday, July 10th, and here is a question that I am hearing more and more as I speak to people about how their children and grandchildren are getting along in this expensive world. And I use the word expensive because I'm talking to people about education, about sending children and grandchildren off to college. And the main question that I'm hearing from many people is it worth it? Is the 4-year expense of a college education worth the benefits it might bring? Now, it turns out that I found a survey that said 36% of Americans have confidence in higher education, and that's down from about 57% before the pandemic struck. But when you look at the cost of college education and the fact that many students take years to pay the tuition fees off, and they have good jobs but not great jobs, and then when you're in that kind of profession and you're attempting to lead a life, a normal life, where money counts and you're strapped with college debt for 10 or 15 years, that's very hard to get your feet on solid ground. So there are many who look for another way to get ahead in life. And community colleges are one of the leading expressways because the fees in a community college are much more reasonable than a 4-year school. And you've got a degree after 2 years that can put you in a position to work, to get a better job. And then there are those who try to find jobs where your employer will pay for your college education. That is so rare today with the cost of college education that it's almost impossible to pay that. Now, when I was going to college and I was working and I was going for my master's degree, the company that I worked for agreed to pay for my master's fee because at that particular time, getting a master's degree was like $125 a semester or something like that. It was not a very expensive proposition. But the company I worked for didn't have a tuition payment plan until I started working there. And when my boss discovered that I was going to school at night to get my master's degree, he convinced the public, he convinced the owners of my company to set up a tuition plan for students so they would get a better quality of employee, they thought. I don't know if that really worked out, but at least it was an opportunity to get your college education paid. But I don't think that happens much anymore. Another way that you could get your college education paid for in those days was a GI Bill. If you served in the armed forces, you could get a college education after you finished your enlistment or your service time. So if you gave the country 2 years of service, you could get a full education. And I had many of my classmates when I was in college were there under the GI Bill. And I was wondering nowadays if the GI Bill still existed with the costs of college education these days. And much to my surprise, it does still exist. And the GI Bill will pay $27,000 a year for tuition if you serve in the armed forces in some way, shape, or form for a period of enlistment. So if you look around and you want to get a decent education, then you give the country 2 years of service and you will get $27,000 a semester or a year, whatever the cost is to go to college. And that is enough money to pay for any public university in the country. And it will certainly pay for about half the tuition costs of these other high-priced schools. So there is a way to get a good education at a reasonable cost if you're willing to put in 2 years of service to the country. And it's a shame that many people do not understand about service. What would happen if you are on the brink of poverty, so to speak, and your child is intelligent and you want him to get a good education? What would be wrong with suggesting to that boy or girl that they give 2 years of service to the armed forces in some way, shape, or form? And that gives you a double benefit, because if you go into the armed forces, they will have some skill that you can learn, in addition to putting the time in that you know you will collect money to go to a public college after you leave the service. But I don't think the public realizes that, or they don't do the homework to figure out how to get a great education for their children at a very reasonable cost. Because when they look at it, they think it's so expensive. I don't think colleges are teaching people what they need to get a job. That's the public thinking right now. And I don't disagree with that public thinking. But what I do disagree with is the fact that there are many out there who are not trying to figure out a way to get around it. And one of the ways around it would be to give public service to this country in some way, shape, or form, like the armed forces. And there may be other services that we could give to the country for a number of years, and in return for that, get a decent college education. Because colleges and the cost of colleges, in my mind, is totally out of whack. And on top of that, when you look at these good schools, they have endowments of billions of dollars. So why do they need to rip people off with their high education fees? They really don't. But there are many schools that will give you a decent education if you fall into some economically deprived category. But I suspect that many in the economically deprived categories have not had good enough educations to get them into some college or other. So in any event, college debt is a major crisis in this country. And I got off target on a couple of points here, especially when I realized that you could still get a decent amount of money from serving your country in the armed forces. So I leave you with that. The cost of college education and the lack of looking properly around to find ways to pay for it. Have a great day. Bye.